Hey folks, Steve here with a special review video for you today. We're going to be looking at Pax Romana, the ancient Mediterranean world, 300 BC to 50 BC, designed by the late Richard Berg, published by GMT Games. This is the second printing, sort of like a deluxe printing from 2015. And I should mention right away that this video, the contents of it, my thoughts, are all derived from Solitaire play. The game is intended to be a multiplayer game, and I chose to just play it, splitting my mind and playing through Solitaire. So my review is going to reflect that. When the time comes that I will have played the game properly multiplayer, at some point in the future, I may come back and do an addendum video and kind of talk about how it changes the game. Right now, some of that is conjecture. There's a huge difference between Solitaire and a multiplayer game, obviously. Now, the Solitaire games that I played were two campaign scenarios, one from a C3I magazine, and then one that came in the box at the second printing. If you'd like to watch an in-depth series of videos covering those playthroughs, you can watch them on my channel, but this video will assume that you didn't take the time to do all of that, and we will cover game rules explanation and overview of the mechanics here very shortly in the video. So if you're just looking to see how the game works and all of that, and some pictures of the components or footage of the components, that'll be coming up here very shortly. So yeah, I think those are some of the disclaimers I have to get out of the way. Again, you can watch through all that content. This video should suffice. We're going to do my true sort of review final thoughts at the end of the video. In the transition here, there will be a timestamp that you can skip to if you're not interested in seeing sort of the game mechanics explanation. You just want to get to the end, you can skip right to that part, and we'll talk through it. So yeah, I think that's all I want to do for intro. We'll see you in the game mechanics explanation then. Okay, so this is what the game looks like in the aftermath of a campaign playthrough. And just so you get a sense of the components and what all is actually included in the game, you can see there is a map. Now, this is a mounted map board. I do have it under plexiglass, just because I prefer that to hold the map down, and it tends to make moving counters around. I just prefer it, I guess. That's one way to look at it. If you like mounted boards, then it's going to work great for that. If you don't like to use plexi with mounted boards, obviously the mounted board works just fine and is great. I think the first edition had just a paper map, so something to keep in mind if you prefer or you're trying to find a good deal on a game. Now, the second printing, deluxe printing, however you want to look at it, there's a lot of counters, a lot. Now, I'll point out that these are actually quite nice brown core, thick counters. I did not take the time to clip them because there's just so dang many of these things. But there are province control markers. There are various counters for non-player powers like tribes, barbarians. You have an assortment of counters for towns and cities and galley squadrons and all the different types of units, which we'll get to here shortly. Independent powers, mercenaries, soldiers of fortune, minor powers like Egypt, Pergamum, Syracuse. There's a lot here. And you're going to need a fair amount of table space, not just to have the counters to organize, which as disorganized as this looks, there's a method to my madness. You've got space for the mat and the map, and then off to the side here, each player has a player mat where important things like their income, some holding boxes, their civilization point in geographical objective points, which we'll talk about, are shown here on tracks. So you have markers to denote the values, how many provinces you control, how many towns and cities you control, your treasury, how much money you have at a given point. Each player will have their own map for that. And so that adds even more potential required table space that you're going to need to play this game. The map is a standard map, but the addition of all these other things will put additional strain on your table. The game is principally split between 4 players if you're playing sort of a standard campaign scenario, but there are a number of different scenarios in the playbook that allow for 2 players, 3 players, of different configurations, that are maybe sometimes shorter in turn. So sometimes they're just 2 to 3 or 4 turns long. But the big scenarios will tend to be something like 10 turns long, which can take much longer to play. The game is also split between a standard game and an advanced game. The differences are that the advanced game will use cards to do events rather than rolling off or drawing chits or anything like that. And ultimately, it also means that there are more events in aggregate for the advanced game. That's the way it seemed to me in evaluating the rules. Now, I played the advanced game, and each time that I played this, so most of my thoughts are coming from that perspective. But the cards themselves, I should point out, this is not a card driven game. This is a card assisted game. So there is a singular deck of cards. When you're playing the advanced game, each player will basically draw one of these each time that they go. And if it is a play when drawn card, you immediately execute the card instructions. But there will be times where you can hold it in hand and play it at an appropriate time for a special action. And these can be quite potent and very powerful, but they're also part of the game's randomness engine. So I sort of mentioned this in the first part of the segment that you are playing a power, a major power in the ancient world, but those independent powers, barbarian invasions, slave revolts, all these things can happen in large part because of the game deck. That deck of cards is reshuffled every turn, and so there's always some chance of the same types of events coming up on some frequency. So you can't bet that because there's a barbarian invasion one turn that there might not be one next turn. There very well could be. And so you, as a player, are navigating, expanding your empire, investing in it, seeing it grow, fighting your opponents, both player and non-player, and trying to survive these sort of random events or these other things that are going to happen, like those revolts and invasions and everything else. The players are split across some odd choices. Some of this is because the game is rooted a little bit as a war game, but it tries to make accommodations to make it a game. So the players are Rome, which certainly makes sense with a game called Pax Romana. Even if the name doesn't really match the time period, I've made that complaint in some of my other videos you probably didn't see. Um, but it is Rome, Carthage, some obvious ones, Greece, which is a bit of an interesting topic, and then a power simply called the East. Now, in these standard, simpler game scenarios, it means that Greece becomes this singular entity when it really was not at the time. Same thing with the East. The East in the standard game covers all of Syria, Judea, Egypt, Cyrenaica as one power, which historically they were not. And that's going to rub some people the wrong way. And in fact, I think that the game first released, it really did. Now, there are scenarios in the playbook that change this up a little bit. And that is why I played one of the scenarios that I did on camera, where Egypt becomes its own non player power, representing Ptolemaic Egypt. The East controls just this and is the Seleucid Empire, another one of the successor states. And then Greece is a non player, kind of a chaotic element, which helps represent the more dispersed polities that existed in Greece. So, depending on your level of, like, historical thirst, you may dial up that detail and play with those more advanced scenarios or rulings. If you're just trying to play a simpler game, then maybe you dial that back, and Greece is a regular player, and the East is just that weird amalgamation. Excuse me. But that'll be up to you and your buddies if you're going to play this as a multiplayer game. Obviously, Solitaire, hey, it's up to you. Um, the players are all vying for victory points. Those victory points are usually derived uh, from a check at the end of each turn where you are comparing the sort of size and economical development of your empires. That is split into the civilization points and the objective points that I mentioned earlier. The way it works is you get a certain number of civilization points for each town or city that you control. So a town gives you one, a city gives you three. You can turn a town into a city and you can build new towns that can then become cities, but that costs money. It also costs the removal of units that you have to sort of settle and create the town or city. And of course, units also cost money. So increasing your civilization points is basically a function of your economy. You're putting money into the system and they will pay that money back over time because you get money for towns and cities as well. The player with the most civilization points will get a certain number of victory points at the end of the turn. The second player, the player with the second most civilization points, will get some, but less than the number one spot, and then so on, third, fourth. GOP, geographic objective points, are similar. You want more than your opponents, but they're derived a little bit differently. You basically get them for control of provinces. And so if I were to adjust the camera a little bit, you can kind of see there are some boundaries drawn. There's a boundary line here, some boundary lines here. Basically, like Western Sicily, which is named, West Sicily, showing this set of spaces right here. That is a province. So if you control it, you get one GOP. If you control East Sicily, which may have a different number of potential spaces, you will get a GOP. So this sort of represents if you think of building cities as building tall, grabbing provinces is building wide. And there is a victory point, I guess, slant where GOP is usually more valuable than Civ points, but you're going to get GOP via expansion, meaning moving your armies, potentially fighting your opponent to take control of those provinces. You can control a province when you control half or more of the spaces in that territory, and you only retain control by having either garrisons there. So I'd show a little zero strength garrison, which is almost like a political control marker in a lot of other games, or the rest of your armies, or a town or a city. So as long as you have basically a counter of your color on a space, you can control it. If it's your home territory, like Italy is for Rome, you don't need anything there to control it. The only issues will be if you have an enemy and an opponent in your territory taking control from you. And now there's some nuances to the rules in there that can complicate the explanation I just gave, but those are the high level bits of it. So the players are basically deciding with their limited number of activations what they're going to do. Are they going to try to expand their civilization points? Are they going to try to expand their GOP points in the hope that they come out ahead and get more victory points? Now, it doesn't matter if you have 10 more than second place, you're always going to get the same amount of victory points. So an efficient way to tackle the game is always to be a little bit ahead of your opponents so that you're not wasteful of your actions, but you still want to be first, and that kind of gets into the strategy of the game. When I talk about activations, this game has a chit pull mechanism. You're going to have a cup or some opaque container or something that you're going to put activation markers in. These are just simple chits that say power activation. They're sort of on the back masked, so in case you're just moving them in a pile on your table, but I used a cup. So players will activate. You sometimes also have minor powers that can get an activation and do stuff, and those are randomly drawn from the cup, right? The scenario that you're playing will define which or how many each player will get in terms of the activation markers. And at the beginning of the turn, there'll always be a set order with the player with the fewest victory points going first, and then all the way up where the person who has the most or is in the lead of the game would go last in the first string of activation markers. And then the rest of the activation markers will be drawn randomly. So you'll get to go right away in the first part of the turn in some known order, but then everything else becomes chaos. And you're going to make your decisions thinking, okay, I know my opponent may still have some activation markers. This is my last one. What do I want to do to try to cement my control? Or I'm going last. What kind of lasting effect can I make for those victory checks at the end of a turn? But you only get so many. So again, I'm going to stress the efficiency. How are you going to make each activation really work the best for you at any given time? That's a really important part of the game. Another element of the game is stability. Whenever you gain control of a province or lose a province, a few other effects, your stability marker, which is tracked up here at the top of the map, will go up and down. And the best that I can tell, the main effect is there are some event cards in the deck, or could come up in a standard game, where your stability is checked. And if it's very poor or very low, then you will suffer a number of penalties that could be quite bad. So you do want to keep your stability levels up. There are different things that influence that, that can get a very nuanced part of the rules. I don't want to get too deep there, but that is going to be a concern of the game over time. It's just trying to stay relatively stable. Bad things can happen to you over the course of the game, and you kind of have to just hope for the best and navigate, the challenges of the game wherever you can. There's going to be things that stop you from doing what you want to do. So there are tribes that live in the areas like Gaul or Germania or the Danube, that start the game with a mystery side. If you move into their space or attack them, you will flip to reveal how strong they are. They're typically not immensely powerful, but you will need to have some level of force with you to guarantee that they are pushed out of the territory. And so you can take control of some territories just by moving in and coexisting with those markers. But if you're going to get more than half, sometimes you really do have to attack these tribes and knock them out. And so there's a little bit of mystery involved, and you're going to pick and choose where you want to expand to make, again, the most of your activations, or simply be fighting against your opponent. The one other thing I guess I should mention before I get into the combat stuff is that the economy system in this game is really rather straightforward, and most things are within a span of one, two, or three. You're either going to get one talent, two talents, or three talents. Units are going to cost 1 to 2 talents. Cities are going to cost so many talents, or you're going to get so many talents for cities. The main thing is, generally speaking, one province is going to get you that one GOP point. It's going to get you one talent, 1 gold, 1 money, whatever you want to refer to it. The game uses the word talent. 1 talent for a province, unless it's an itty bitty province that isn't worth anything, like the Baleares, Melita, Malta, have this sort of X over the money symbol, meaning you don't get money for them, even if you get the province victory point, or a GOP point rather. You're not going to get money for it, but generally they're going to be worth 1 per province. Some provinces, like Italia, are worth 2 talents. Some are even worth 3, like Egypt. So there is basically a note that certain provinces are better than others, but generally, if you can get a province, you're going to get a talent. A town will give you 1 talent. A city will give you 3. And so you can start to map out how much money you're going to get over the course of the turn as you grab territory or build new towns or cities. You can figure out the investment, return on investment of building towns and cities. And then ultimately, units will cost money, and it depends on what kind of unit you're looking to build. Each faction can build a sort of really strong infantry. So for most factions, that is going to be a heavy infantry. For the Romans, they're going to get to build legions. 1 unit of heavy infantry will have 3 combat power. A legion will have 4, so there's sort of an inherent advantage to that. But there are other units as well. There are light infantry that are 1 for 1, and then there are elephants, and there are cavalry. Cavalry costing 2, I should point out as well. So heavy infantry cost 2, cavalry cost 2. Now, the extra purchase, right? You could just spend a bunch of gold and buy a bunch of light infantry, but of course you get more combat power for spending the extra talents on the heavy infantry. And for cavalry are just 1 combat power per talent, but they provide advantages in combat. So we'll talk about the combat system here shortly, but that's just something I want you to keep in mind, that what you decide to build in your economic activity will be driven by strategic decisions, like, hey, you need more cavalry, or you'd really prefer to have more heavy infantry, or maybe you want to throw some elephants into the game a little bit. You're going to spend your money on those types of things, thinking through what you would like to build. Also, point out that there are these galley squadrons. They are also 2 cost, and these are not used for naval transport explicitly. They're used to protect naval transport. So we'll talk about that here shortly as well. But just keep in mind, you don't need to travel navally uh, with these guys, but they will protect your naval movement, and they are just valuable to have in general. So something else you'll be wanting to spend money on. The really interesting thing about the game is that each region or territory, which is a group of provinces, tells you what kinds of units you can get there. So, for instance, the Sicilies, you can only build light infantry in the Sicilies. Let me see if I can find. Oh, there it is. It's covered. There's a little marker here, a little box that says light infantry LI. Carthage, which is down here, the Carthage territory, you can build heavy infantry, light infantry, cavalry, and elephants. In Rome, you can only build legions. So you can start to see, like, okay, you will want to take territory. Like Rome may want to take Narbonensis early if they can, because in Gaul you can build light infantry and cavalry. Now there are some special rules that govern Rome having sort of inherent cavalry. I'll let you read the rules for that. I did use that rule in the game I played. But that gives you a strategic incentive to go after certain territories. Narbonensis gives you 2 talents. That's good, and it gives Rome access to light infantry and cavalry, something they don't get natively in Rome, generally speaking. So there's an incentive to grab different territories. Some start off really good, but like Greece can only build heavy infantry, a bit like Rome, where the East has access to all the troop types. So there's these different drivers that pull you in different directions, all that have some level of risk and reward, which is a really, I think, big part of the game is managing that risk and deciding what you want to do, what the potential rewards will be for getting the things that you're going to get. So I think that's enough of the basic stuff, the economical stuff, the grand strategic stuff. Let me talk quickly about the battle system. Okay, I've zoomed in a little bit just so we can focus on some of the context. What happens when you pull an activation marker for land movement? If you decide to do an expansion action, you're going to get 2 minor moves and a major move. A minor move is as simple as activating 1 unit to do stuff. And to do that, you're basically going to roll a die, and whatever you roll is how many movement points they get. So you can say, oh, okay, there's 5. And if we had a unit that was here, that means they could go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or something to that effect. Or I guess we would be able to get out to here. That's just some minor moves. You're going to use those minor moves to make adjustments or to do small expansion to areas, like just put a few units in a Narbonensis here in the west to make some gains. But your major moves, which you'll want to do with leaders, are going to be your big campaigns, the big changes you're going to make. And you're only going to get so many of those per turn. So you're going to look at a leader. Each faction will get 2 leaders per turn. They are drawn randomly from a pool of leaders. You're going to place 1 in your capital. You're going to place another where you have an army or a group of units. And they will add their second number on their counter to the die roll. So if I had rolled a 5 and I activated this stack, I'd have 5 plus 5. I'd actually have 10 movement points. So leaders obviously heavily increase your ability to move units, and they can get a lot farther. The first number on a leader counter is their tactical rating, their battle rating, and that will provide a benefit to combat. Now, in this game, there are certainly rules that govern interception and avoid combat. So just as by way of illustration, these guys could move here, and if they did, the Carthaginian player could try to intercept. They'd roll 2 dice, they'd add a few modifiers, and if they reached the right number, they could come into here and there would be a fight. Alternatively, the Roman player could move here, then try to move against the Carthaginians, and they could withdraw from combat. They would roll a die, and that would tell them how many movement points they could withdraw with, which in this case would be you know, one, two, a couple different ways they could go. Maybe if this guy wasn't here, they'd retreat all the way back to here. Now, the Roman player could continue moving and try to catch them, but of course, maybe the Carthaginians run out of places to retreat to, and it's going to force some combat or vice versa. So there is a sense of maneuver, but I'm going to point something out to you, and it's probably something I should have mentioned. In this game that covers 250 years, or whatever it is, each turn represents about 25 years of time, which means over the course of your 3 or 4 activations, 3 or 4 major campaign moves, what you're really representing are multiple campaigns, multiple battles taking place over 25 years. So while we're doing this sort of interception maneuver type of warfare, moving through different spaces, the end result is to reflect all of that campaigning and combat, even if there's only 1 or 2 combat die rolls. And it's something really important that might rub you the wrong way as you look to play this game. Are you okay with it trying to represent 25 years of time? And even probably on top of that, um, do you understand why the battle system works the way that it does in terms of losses to reflect that they're really attritional losses more so than other games that might work very differently, right? So let's talk about the actual combat system to reflect that. So in this example situation, we would have, well, not a great fight. Um, so the Romans would have you count up the combat power of your unit. So here we have a legion and a reduced legion. So 4 plus 2 is 6. We compare that to the Carthaginians, which just have 2. They have a cavalry and a light infantry. So 6 to 2 is 3 to 1. So in some war games, you have like 3 to 1 and you roll on a combat results table. Here, having a 3 to 1 advantage gives you 3 shifts in combat. So remember shifts for a second. We also compare our leaders. Now the leaders both have a 2 value, so there are no net shifts for that. If the Romans didn't have a leader at all, then the Carthaginians would get 2 shifts. They'd have 2 tactical rating versus 0 for the Romans, but as it is in this example, it's 2 to 2, so it nullifies. The Carthaginians have cavalry, while we'll say in this case the Romans do not. They don't. We're not going to use the optional rule about inherent cavalry. Again, you can read the rules for that if you're interested. They have more cavalry than the Romans. They don't have 2 to 0. They have 1 to 0, which gives them cavalry superiority. That's worth 1 shift. If the Carthaginians had twice as many, or 2 if the opponent has 0 cavalry, meaning a lot more cavalry than the opponent, you would get cavalry supremacy, which is worth 3 shifts. So all things told, we would have 3 shifts for the Romans. We would have 1 shift for the Carthaginians. You see the difference between them, which is 2 in favor of the Romans. The Romans have 2 shifts. What does that mean? When you roll the dice, we'll just do an example die roll. If the Romans rolled a 5, the Carthaginians rolled a 4, the Romans could take the 2 shifts and decide to shift the die roll up or down on both, on either. So they could go, bring this down to a 3 for 1 shift and bring this up to a 6 for another shift, and have that be the die roll results for either side. So you could see we're like having a lot of shifts. You could even bring this down to 0 actually and have it the Carthaginians do no damage. Or you could increase, if you rolled a 6 and say you had 4 shifts, you could bring this up to 100, or to 10, which equals a percent losses. And now there are charts that help you with this if you need them. But basically, if you said, okay, I did 6, I have my 6 result, you'd calculate that as 60%. So 60% of 2, that is basically 1. So the Carthaginians would have to lose 1 unit, that kind of thing. Or in this case, what's 60% of 6? You would have to remove that much battle power from your stacks. So it's sort of this weird attritional thing. If you have the right number of shifts, you can almost sometimes guarantee that your army's not going to take any damage or minimal damage. In other cases, you have a strong potential to completely wipe out your opponent. It's just mattering on those shifts. A lot of people don't like this, or I've seen a lot of folks not be happy with the way the mechanics work. I'm okay with it after playing it enough because what you're really trying to do in a strategic sense is get all of those advantages. You want to have that cavalry advantage. You want to have the better leader. You want to have the better units involved, the legions versus light infantry, for instance, where you gain all these advantages where it's not swingy. It is actually still within some band of, I guess, realism or acceptability to say, well, like, yeah, I did a battle of Cannae and I wiped out your army for relatively minimal losses. Like that can happen in this game, given the right circumstances. And other times, if there are no special advantages to either side, you might have, very bloody battles for both sides. You might have, slight differences. And it's really not all that different from any other ancient battle system where you're rolling dice and seeing who's losing what. So I do kind of enjoy it, and it does work pretty well. And the different units give you the different advantages, like I said. Now, one special thing is our elephants. And basically, if you have elephants, you say whether or not you're going to use it. And if you do, you roll a die. That die roll might mean that an enemy cavalry is negated for the battle, which can shift the cavalry superiority. It might also do an additional hit on the enemy army before the rest of the combat occurs, or that elephant could rampage and hurt your guys. So elephants are sort of this random element that you can put in if you think it's going to be helpful to you. And so there's all these little decisions that come into that combat system. The naval combat is a little simpler. Whenever there's a naval combat, excuse me, I should edit that out, but I'm probably not going to. When you have a naval battle, what you're doing is you are having each side's going to roll one die, and you're going to add your combat power of your involved galleys, and you'll add one if a leader is present. Doesn't matter how good the leader is. So if this was a combat here, it would be a die roll +2 for the Romans, a die roll +4 for the Carthaginians, and basically the high roller is going to win, and the difference between the die rolls is what has to be removed or destroyed. And even the winner, just due to attrition, might still lose a unit. So the naval battles can be pretty tough. They can be very deterministic. You know that the Carthaginians are very likely going to win this fight given most die rolls, but they could still have a weakened navy after the fact. The actual naval movement is going to occur across these blue lines of connection between spaces. And I guess I should really talk through the naval stuff because it is more important than you think. Okay, when it comes to naval movement, it's actually the fastest way to get far distances in this game, but there are some oddities to it as well. I'm going to set up another example so that you understand. Ports are the spaces that have some blue tinge to them. Might be kind of hard to see on camera, but they're going to be the coastal spaces, and again, connected via these naval connections in addition to land connections. The key thing with naval movement is that it costs 1 movement point for a force doing naval movement. I should say land units doing naval transport, but naval movement is 1 to embark units onto ships, is one way to look at it, 1 to do the naval movement itself, and then another movement point to disembark at a destination. So the quick hand of that is 3 movement points will get you a naval move. So if you roll less than 3 movement points on a force, or you have less than 3 movement points, you're not going to be doing any more naval movement or any naval movement at all. If you have more, then you could conceivably do, you could have like 10 movement points. You could do a naval move, do another naval move, do another naval move, and then move 1 more space. But the trick with the naval system in this game is that there are things that will impede you. So as long as you control a space, you can move your naval transport through that space without an issue. So let's look at Carthage, for instance. You could pass through this space, no problem. Now, there are these transit points that are on the long stretches of naval transport lines. So you can see some that are near the Sicilies, a couple different places. This is just to represent tougher waters or long periods of transport without ports in the way. So it's a little bit of a tougher attritional perspective. When you hit one of these spaces, you have to roll a die. You might stop there and then movement is stopped. That's kind of not good. And you have to try to roll to continue. And if your uh, naval transport or galleys are in a space you don't control, like here or some other place that you don't control at the end of a turn, they get destroyed. So you have to hope that you still have more activations to try to move them off these spaces. But basically, what should happen is this Carthaginian force spends 3 movement points, is how I like to look at it. Say they're going to spend 3 movement points to do naval movement wherever they end up, but they're going to go here. They're going to roll to continue. Then they're going to get to here. They're fine here. They can move on without issue. They'll get to here, once again, roll. Then they're going to get to here. Now, at the beginning of the game, depending on what scenario you're playing, the Carthaginians might not control this space of Malacca. So if this force moved into here, they would have to roll to continue. Now, they get benefits for having a leader and different things. If they fail, they're stuck here and they have to stop moving. If there were enemy units in this space that they failed to move past, then they would actually have to fight those forces. There's some nuance to the rules there. But because we had a town or a city or a garrison, we can pass through this just fine because we control it. Now we can move here. We have a garrison. We can move on because we control it. Same thing here. And as when we get to this space where there's a barbarian army, by point of example, I have to roll to continue. And if I fail, then we're going to have to land and fight these guys, which would probably be a bad thing. So you can kind of see a situation where, just by another point of example, we had some more garrisons. Let's just say had garrisons all the way out to here. You could actually, for very few die rolls, move from, the bottom of Baetica down here in Hispania. You could very quickly go all the way up here, maybe get to here, and then you're invading Italy very fast. You can cover a huge amount of distance for few movement points. And if this guy still had, 7 movement points left after that naval move, then he's still got plenty to move in and cause some havoc into Italy. And that's how you use the naval stuff to the best effectiveness. You have to control the ports. You basically want to create a string of safe ports, and then you can go very far and project your influence much farther. Now, we could send that force without galleys, but we'd have to stop here because the enemy has a galley squadron in this port. If they were to go into there, they would just die because the galley squadron is actual military naval ships that can fight well. They would just destroy the transport ships. This whole stack would die. So by point of the Romans putting a galley unit here, they're sort of saying this is the boundary of our naval control, and we're going to block any other naval invasions to the Italian coast here. The difference would be if the Carthaginians took galley squadrons with them, in which case they could move all together and maybe force a naval combat, defeat or push back the Roman squadron, which maybe could retreat and decide to move away. But now we're sort of forcing that naval control back, and the Carthaginians are operating in Italy proper. So that's the thing. You can move navally without galleys, but you're best to use them to escort your units. There are some surprise event cards that can destroy a naval transport fleet without a galley protection stack with it. And then obviously, you could send your galleys by themselves without transporting units just to go fight and clear the sea lanes. So do not mistake the naval system for something that can simply be ignored. It is an integral part of the game, building up your fleets. Fleets have a maintenance cost, so they're always dragging on your economy, but they pay off in your ability to project force, to beat back your enemy's sort of naval boundary. And all of that, again, comes together to be a really interesting interplay of all these different decisions that the players have to make. Are they going to do something with naval? Are they going to move by land only, which is safer, which will take longer? Are they going to spend their money to build towns? Or are they going to build their build cities, or are they going to try to take control of territories? And where do they want to go for the better money, or for the safer locations, or the need to recruit cavalry? All these interesting decisions that come into play. And we showed a lot of stuff over here, but over here there's plenty of things to care about as well, with roads and Pergamum, and Pontus can show up in the north of Asia Minor. A lot of different things that can be coming together, a lot of different activities, surprises around the corner. I mean, there's just a lot here to absorb. And in some ways, that could be a bad thing, because for me, as a person just looking at the game, I could read the rules, I could play it, but there's a lot of nuance to the rules. I've tried to explain the basics, but there are little things that you really have to keep in mind that go beyond this explanation. So, me just explaining this, I wouldn't say you would know how to play the game. I think you would really need to read the rule book and understand how all of these things come together. You look at all the nuances of the specific rules to understand how the game really plays at the table, and that you play it properly. I hope that has sufficed as a way to understand the way that the game works and some of the highlights of the system. I think we can go ahead and turn it over to my final thoughts and actual review conclusions on the game. Okay, so uh, my time with this game, again, being based really on the solitaire play. Um, I think the game is pretty fun. It's a good one. I think it does a lot of interesting things, but it has aspects that frustrate me a little bit, and it's not going to fit well for everyone. And that's really the tricky thing. It's probably why this game hasn't gotten as much hype, I think, in a lot of the game circles that I'm in, where certain multiplayer games are just known to be, hey, these are these great games. We love getting them to the table every year at conventions or whatever. And this game has just sort of been away off of that radar, and I can kind of see why. So, um, first things first, probably want to point out the name Pax Romana to me doesn't really make sense. The time period that's referred to as Pax Romana is after this, so I guess you could kind of say like this is how Pax Romana came to be. But you're not going to see Rome take control of the entire map in this game. That's probably just not going to happen. So it's this weird thing. I feel like it should have been called something else, but that is a nitpick and not a big deal. Um, the game systems in the way that the events can come out and morph the game situation, so that it's not just a player versus player activity, but it's a player, it's like a true grand strategy kind of game, I think is really cool. And it's a strength of the game that you can have all these different elements. Sometimes it can feel like those elements are overwhelming because there's just so much going on. There's different things going on all the time that are coming up, and that could just be hard for folks to deal with. Um, but it is a great way to have. I don't know. It makes me think of, like, I don't know, Rome Total War, where you can kind of play a bunch of different factions, doing a bunch of different things in the ancient world, in that way, where Pontus is showing up, Pergamum, Rhodes, a barbarian invasion from Gaul can happen. All these different things that come together and just make for a really interesting game experience. But the way the economic system works out is that you're not always really going out into the wilderness. You're not really expanding on the map. You're just trying to beat out your opponent. And I think there are different ways that they could have implemented the victory point system to incentivize actually growing big rather than just being a little bit bigger than your opponents, which is really what the game system incentivizes for economy of actions, but using your activations efficiently. Um, the combat system is interesting. I like the basic system with interception, withdrawals, combat shifts, understanding that it's representing a 25-year campaign, which won't feel right to everybody. I think it makes sense to me enough that I'm okay with it. Are there better ways to have done it? Maybe. I think over time, now that I've really played through it enough, I feel okay about it. And it certainly has its cool, fun aspects when you set up a big battle and you've got your elephants and the cavalry and you're trying to figure everything out. It can be a very fun, thematic experience for that sort of thing. From a solitaire perspective, I think the real challenge is figuring out how the game could be different with other players. So I play a certain way, and if I'm just playing myself, it's going to reflect that on the table. But other players with different personalities, different styles of play, different desires would do different things than what I would do. And I feel like by playing it solitaire, I'm missing out on that. And I do think that while you can play it solitaire as sort of an experience thing, and it's fun for that, I've had fun with the game. It is truly meant for that multiplayer experience, and I have yet to truly experience what that looks like. The one challenge I could see, and this is kind of a knock against the game, is that the rules, there are a fair number of rules. There are nuances to those rules, and there are little lines that really kind of shift how a mechanic works. That if you were to play a multiplayer and you wanted to play it, a nice, clean game, you actually need to make sure that the players understand all of the rules. And it'll not be an easy time. The players should take the time to read the rules, be familiar with it before playing. That might be really hard just to get a game going, period. And that's probably why I've not seen it played a whole lot at all at conventions or otherwise. I just have not seen it, and this is probably why that there are fiddliness to the rules sometimes. You got to keep in mind that everyone kind of has to know how the rules all work together, and that's a bit of a cost, or like everyone's got to read up on all these rules and really get familiar with it before you can play. And then just playing, there's just so much stuff going on. It can feel very heavy in that way. Even if the game systems really aren't complicated, the way they all come together can probably overwhelm some people to some degree, which will make it harder to play it multiplayer, which is the way it's meant to be played. But again, I still had a good time with it. And what I like about the system is that if you look across the different scenarios in the playbook, the system is adapted for different given situations. There's a whole scenario that focuses on the successors, for instance, and makes it a 3-player game focused on the east side of the map for a successors experience. And that's really interesting. The fact that the game can do that, the fact that I got to play a Greco-Persian War scenario out of the C3I magazine, and that while I have a lot of criticisms of the way that scenario was structured, it still did a pretty good job of morphing the game rules such to support that slightly different era, the slightly different geopolitical situation. And I really like that. I mean, I feel like you could take this system and adapt it even beyond this. And the sad part is, because Richard Berg has passed, we're not going to see that. We're going to, at best we have the sequel, Genesis, which was created, I think, in a way to address the complexity of Pax Romana, and is a lot less complex, and there's a lot fewer mechanics and things involved with it. But I think that might make that game more boring without all these neat interaction of different things going on. And so, what would have been interesting to see, and maybe someday someone can take up the mantle of the series, is could you adapt this system to the time period of the Roman Empire going through civil wars? Could you do this in 500 AD or 600 AD? Or even 800 AD, in the time of Charlemagne? Could you do a medieval version of this system? Could you adapt it appropriately? And I think you probably could. And that's something I've thought a lot about. So this game system as it is now has a lot of potential in it, I think, to still be morphed to interesting degrees that we may never see. But the system as itself, out of the 2 games you can get, Genesis or Pax Romana, I get the feeling like Pax Romana is still the better one because it has just a wealth of this flavor and the different events and the different mechanics. It has a weight to it. There's a lot of counters, a lot of things, but it comes together in a really cool way. So as a solitaire experience, for me, it was probably like a 7.5 or something like that. I feel like it could be greater than that in a true multiplayer context, an 8 or an 8.5, but that's conjecture. So in the future, again, if I'm able to play it multiplayer and I have a wealth of thoughts to share, I will do a follow-up video. But for now, I think this will do it for my Solitaire experience with Pax Romana. This was on my shelf of shame. I'm glad I got it played. I had a good time with it. There are some things that are tough to get around, some things that I don't like. Um, the other thing I didn't like was the rolling for movement points, where you could roll a one and you couldn't really move very far at all, and it was almost like you wasted an activation. I don't like that. I wish there was some way to mitigate that a little bit, and maybe you can use house rules. But that was one of the weird things that sometimes a player just couldn't, a faction couldn't do much because they didn't roll high enough to actually do anything that would affect play, and that I did not like. That could have. I wish there was some way to address that better. Um, but besides that, I mean, it was an interesting playthrough, an interesting system. If you're interested in the game, I would definitely recommend you trying to get a copy and checking it out for yourself, or playing on Vassal or getting a feel for it. I don't think you can buy this direct from GMT anymore. I think you'd have to look on the secondary market, but you probably get it at a reasonable price. And like I said, if you can get the second printing with the better map and the more extra counters and extra scenarios, that's probably the version to get. And I think it's worth a look. If you like the time period and you're looking for something sort of a grand strategy, empire builder, but still kind of a war game product, I think this will do good for you. I think it'll be fun. Obviously, much better if you can convince some of your buddies to try it with you. You could have a lot of fun with it. Um, so there you go, guys. Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you enjoyed the review. Let me know what you think in the comments section down below. We're going to hit up some other games here in the near future. So see you then. Take care, guys. Keep on gaming.